You, Mr. Wittman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank our witnesses for joining us today. We look at the gains that Ukraine has made with assistance from around the world and what's happening to Russian forces. Degraded presence, about 40% of its pre-war fleet of tanks gone, and today 97% of the Russian army is in Ukraine. And even with that, they're struggling. The issue is, for us, the munitions that we're providing to Ukraine. In last year's NDAA, we provided both funding and contracting tools to accelerate replenishing our munition stockpiles, essentially our weapons magazines. I want to talk, though, about where I think there's a strategic mismatch. We give those contracting tools, yet how we evaluate where the needs are, to me, is in contradiction to that. The needs are supposed to be evaluated on the threats in Europe. What's that threat scenario? And as we see, the DoD has up to 2 years to determine that threat scenario. So if we're looking at the scenario 2 years down the road and whatever is happening at that time in Europe, and we are today accelerating the replenishing of our munition stockpile, to me there's a mismatch, because giving 2 years to determine what the needs are, what the threats are, and we're spinning up today to build weapon stockpiles that may be mismatched with what we see 2 years from now, doesn't seem to me to be a good policy. So, Dr. Call, can you tell us, based on our force structure requirements on both munitions and ground forces in Europe, how do we make sure that we are making the right determinations about what to build today so we don't have, again, a mismatch? I mean, we're talking about weapons magazines being depleted today, but if we're building weapons that may not have a role in where we need to be 2 years from now, how do we correct that mismatch?
Yes, thank you. It's a very important question. So obviously we've made significant investments because of the money that Congress has generously given us and the authorities to spend it over longer periods of time to recapitalize our munitions. That means increasing production, but it also means addressing supply chain bottlenecks and creating a longer-term demand so that industry is actually responsive. I think what the Ukraine conflict showed is that, frankly, our defense industrial base was not at the level that we needed it to be to generate munitions. So right now, our priorities are making sure that we are increasing production for the things that we anticipate that Ukraine will continue to need. So a good example is 155 millimeter ammunition for the NATO standard howitzers, but also the guided multiple launch rocket systems, the GIMLRs that launch off the HIMARS systems. Those are going to matter a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, because even if the conflict in Ukraine dies down, and nobody can predict whether that'll happen, Ukraine is going to need a military that can defend the territory it's clawed back and deter the Russians from doing this again. The other investments we're doing, of course, are to replenish our own stocks. And they are actually, I think we're relatively confident we're making the investments that we need not only for Russia contingencies, but also for contingencies vis-a-vis China, North Korea, Iran, et cetera. But beyond that, we can go into some of the specific details in the classified setting, if you'd like, in terms of how we're making targeted investments.
Well, that leads me to the next question. The allocations that we're making today to Ukraine are based on a pre-Ukraine Russian conflict scenario. So if we are holding back those munitions based on that scenario, then are we inadvertently holding back the things that Ukraine may need based on what would be an antiquated scenario? So that I think is a question. And then also, how are the determinations made about what we are doing to replenish our stockpiles and what we're sending to Ukraine? How is that interacting with our needs in the Indo-PACOM?
Yeah, so actually, it's a very important point. So we have a total munitions requirement that is essentially a metric against which we need munitions for a whole range of contingencies. So they are not pegged to any one contingency. It's a pool of munitions we could draw on from a range of different scenarios. We have adjusted that floor to account for the fact that Russia is bogged down in Ukraine. Their land forces have been badly attrited. It has changed the dynamic for a future Russia contingency. At the same time, we have requirements for operational plans in other parts of the world, could be North Korea, Iran, China, et cetera. And so Secretary Austin has been laser focused on making sure that as we draw down from our own stocks, we are getting Ukraine what it needs without taking undue risk to those other plans. And I think we have so far accomplished that. But we also need to recapitalize so that we can build up that hedge in the event that something bad happens elsewhere in the world.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.